Imagine, like, pitching your tent at a really scenic youth hostel. You're enjoying the ocean breeze, the views, and you are just completely unaware that you are sleeping directly on top of a Cold War interrogation center, an obliterated World War II fortress, and a forgotten plague cemetery. Welcome to Mount Davis.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate example of spatial overwriting. I mean, it's this 269-meter hill on the western edge of Hong Kong Island, but it functions less like a natural geographic feature and more like, a physical hard drive.
A hard drive.
Right? Like where history just keeps getting recorded, deleted, and then aggressively recorded over again.
Totally. And that is exactly what we are doing a deep dive into today. We have this incredible stack of historical research about this specific piece of land, and our mission is to basically decode these layers for you.
Because if you hike Mount Davis today, it just looks like a beautiful, straightforward nature trail.
Right, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
But when we actually unpack the archives, we find this incredibly complex timeline. It shows how a city utilizes its space for, well, it's marginalized, it's dead, it's defended, and it's detained.
Exactly. And to truly understand how this mountain functions as a historical ledger, we really have to start with the foundation, the lowest, oldest, and honestly, most hidden layer of this geography.
Right, we have to go back to 1894. There was a devastating bubonic plague outbreak that hit Hong Kong, and it specifically targeted the city's coolie houses.
Yeah, and for context, these were incredibly cramped, highly unsanitary living quarters for marginalized laborers. They were primarily transient dock workers.
Just terrible living conditions.
Horrific. Now, to understand the colonial government's response, you have to remember that medical science in 1894 was just on the cusp of understanding this disease.
Right, they didn't really know what they were dealing with yet.
Exactly. The plague bacillus was actually first isolated during this exact outbreak. But before the science was truly settled, the government's reaction was really driven by panic and, well, forced isolation.
They just needed to put the dead somewhere far, far away from the prosperous core of the city.
Right. So they chose the barren south slope of Mount Davis.
Which, I mean, it just strikes me as sweeping a massive public health crisis under a geographic rug. Just, out of sight, out of mind.
It goes a bit deeper than just hiding a problem, though. The research points out how public health crises are often utilized as mechanisms for political control.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, by forcing burials on this totally isolated edge of the island, the colonial administration was physically removing a marginalized population, even in death, to maintain this illusion of order and hygiene in the city center.
Wow. And the extreme isolation of these workers is just heartbreaking. Our sources mention that if you hike near the modern-day residential area called Civic Village today—
Which takes some serious bushwhacking, by the way.
Yeah, lots of overgrown vegetation. But if you make it through, you can find the physical remnants of this. Tourists can literally spot these massive 8 to 10 foot tall square obelisks just standing in the brush.
Yeah, and there are no names on them. They're just these imposing stone boundary markers.
And scattered right among those obelisks are granite headstones dating back to 1897.
To put that in context for you, 1897 is the Guangxu era of the Qing dynasty. This was a period of massive political and social upheaval in mainland China.
Right, which is what originally drove so many of these desperate laborers to Hong Kong to begin with.
Exactly. And because they were transient dock workers, they usually died utterly alone. They didn't have family in the city.
So the inscriptions on these 1897 headstones, they don't say beloved father or cherished son. They literally just read graves of our late friends.
It's so sad.
It really is. They were paid for by fellow dock workers just pooling whatever pennies they had left.
It is a profound artifact of communal grief. But it also introduces this defining mechanism of Mount Davis that we're going to see a lot today. The living constantly driving out the dead.
Right, because that cemetery doesn't stay untouched.
No, it was officially closed by 1906, and by 1914, the military was literally paving access paths directly over those graves.
Just paving right over them. That is wild.
Exactly. And even today, those ruins are caught in the crosshairs of proposed public housing developments. It forces a really difficult conversation about what a rapidly growing city values.
Yeah, like when space is at an absolute premium, whose history gets a curated museum and whose history just gets, paved over for a new apartment block.
Precisely. But that dynamic of pushing marginalized people to the edges, it wasn't just reserved for impoverished dock workers.
Right, so moving slightly up the slope, the sources show another group finding sanctuary on this mountain, but for an entirely different reason related to race and identity.
Yes, the Eurasian community. So in late 19th century Hong Kong, societal lines were rigidly binary. You were categorized as either European or you were Chinese.
There was no in-between.
Right. The legal and social system simply did not accommodate a middle ground. So if you were of mixed heritage, you existed in this weird bureaucratic and social void.
And that extended to death, too. I mean, Eurasian families were routinely barred from European Christian cemeteries, and at the exact same time, they were rejected by traditional Chinese burial grounds.
It is wild to think about, literally having nowhere to be buried because the paperwork of society doesn't have a box for you to check.
That specific lack of a box is what led Sir Robert Ho Tung and his brother Ho Fook, who, by the way, were rapidly becoming some of the wealthiest business figures in Hong Kong, to aggressively lobby the governor in 1897.
Yeah, they basically demanded a permanent resting place for their community. And they were finally granted a plot on Mount Davis, which became the Chiu Yuen Cemetery.
Now, I'm looking at photos of this place in our research, specifically the Ho Chang gravesite, built in 1915. And honestly, it just looks like a private billionaire's family plot.
Visually, it really does.
Yeah, it's massive, it's incredibly ornate, and it just dominates the landscape. So, are we sure this was actually a space for the broader Eurasian community? Or did the Ho family just monopolize a chunk of the mountain for themselves?
It's a completely fair challenge because, yeah, the Ho family monuments do totally dominate the space, but legally, it has always been a public cemetery for the entire Eurasian community.
Oh, okay.
The Ho family were just the original trustees. They had the financial capital and the political leverage to actually secure and develop the land initially.
Okay, that makes sense. But the architecture of that specific gravesite is fascinating. Tourists can go see it, and it's this bizarre but beautiful blend.
Right, it's very...
You know, these neoclassical Western elements, but it is structured with an incredibly strict Confucian hierarchy. It's literally built into the slope in 4 distinct tiers.
Yeah, tell them about the tiers. It's really interesting.
So the highest tier at the top, that's for the patriarch and the principal wife. Then you step down to the second tier, and that's reserved for the concubines. The third tier is for descendants, and the bottom is this lovely memorial garden.
This is where we get into a sociological concept called the third space.
The third space.
Yes. When a community is systematically rejected by the dominant cultures around them, they have to invent a third space to anchor their identity. What's remarkable here is the psychology of overcompensation.
Oh, like trying to prove they belong.
Exactly. Because the Eurasian community was denied legitimacy by traditional Chinese society, they responded by adhering to Chinese Confucian burial rituals even more strictly and elaborately than purely Chinese families did.
It's like they're saying, oh, you think we aren't traditional? We are going to build the most traditional, rigidly hierarchical monument you have ever seen.
Precisely. And you see it in the headstones, too. They are bilingual, mixing English names with traditional Chinese formatting. It was a very conscious physical assertion of a unique identity. They were literally carving it into the stone of the mountain because they weren't allowed to exist comfortably anywhere else. Even modern figures like the Macau casino tycoon Stanley Ho are buried there today, continuing that lineage.
So while the Eurasian community is literally carving their identity into the slopes, the British Empire is busy asserting its own dominance right above them.
Right at the top.
Yeah, if you hike past the cemeteries to the very summit of Mount Davis, you hit the military layer.
Yes. Between 1909 and 1912, the colonial military constructed this massive fortress at the peak. They proudly dubbed it the Gibraltar of the West.
Which is a very confident name. Maybe a little too confident.
Overly confident, as history would prove. The entire defensive strategy of this fort was predicated on a single, flawed assumption that any threat to Hong Kong would come from the sea.
Right. So they installed these 5 enormous 9.2-inch guns.
Oh, they were absolute behemoths. I mean, they were specifically designed to punch through the heavy armor of enemy warships trying to sail into Victoria Harbor from the west.
But warfare technology didn't politely stick to the British Empire's assumptions. When December 1941 rolls around and World War II comes to Hong Kong, the Japanese military doesn't just sail ships into the harbor.
No, they attack from the land, and crucially from the air.
Right, which totally exposes a fatal flaw driven by, well, imperial arrogance.
Exactly. The British colonial defense strategy had this rigid over-reliance on traditional sea power. They completely failed to adapt to the evolving realities of aerial bombardment and multi-directional land assaults.
So Mount Davis, this supposedly impenetrable fortress, just found itself subjected to devastating crossfire from heavy artillery stationed on the hills across the harbor.
The human toll of that strategic failure is really grim. Our sources detail how, on December 14th, the fort's magazine, the main ammunition store, took a direct hit. Yeah. It instantly killed 9 Indian gunners. And that detail stops me in my tracks, because the standard textbook narrative of World War II in this region often paints it as a very simple East versus West conflict.
Right, but the presence of those Indian gunners completely shatters that simplified narrative. The defense forces were incredibly diverse.
Very diverse. You had British soldiers, Indian gunners, and local Hong Kong volunteers fighting, suffering, and dying together on a peak. It was a truly global cross-section of people caught in the collapse of this fortress.
And they held out without water or power until Christmas Day, when the surrender was finally ordered.
Yeah.
There's this striking detail of a British gunner named Charlie Brooks. He personally blew up the remaining big guns right at the end, just to ensure the invading forces couldn't use them against anyone else.
It was a desperate final move.
It's like installing a state-of-the-art, impenetrable steel vault door on the front of your house, but leaving the roof completely open. And then you have to blow up your own vault when the burglars just drop in from the ceiling.
That is exactly the mechanism of what happened. The architecture of defense became obsolete almost the moment it was tested.
And if you visit today, you can walk the Mount Davis Battery Heritage Trail. It's a Grade 2 historic building. Tourists can walk through the concrete ruins of those gun emplacements. But the irony of what this space has become is just incredible.
The repurposing of it is fascinating.
Yeah, Gun Emplacement 1's former military parade ground, where soldiers literally prepped for a doomed defense, is now the campsite for a youth hostel.
And Emplacement 4 was hollowed out to be used as a civilian water tank.
It is a physical manifestation of a city reclaiming space. The instruments of war are literally repurposed to hold drinking water and host teenagers on holiday.
It really is.
Okay, so we're going to move from the deafening, very public explosions at the summit during World War II back down to the foot of the mountain. And this brings us to a much quieter, almost invisible conflict during the Cold War.
Yes. Down at the intersection of Victoria Road and Mount Davis Path, there is a white building complex that originally served as a military battery, but in 1950, its function changed drastically when it was handed over to this special branch.
And I want to be clear here, looking strictly at the declassified archives and historical sources without taking any sides or getting tangled in the politics of the Cold War itself, the mechanics of what this facility was used for are intense.
Very intense. To understand the special branch, you have to look at the colonial apparatus of the time. This was essentially a covert intelligence and police force guided by Britain's MI5.
Okay.
And this specific white building complex, which tellingly had no official address, became the Victoria Road Detention Center. It was often just called the White House.
And it was basically a black site, right?
Exactly. It was used for deep interrogations. They held high-profile figures there without trial.
The cases in the research honestly read like a spy thriller. You have the 1961 case of Sang Chiu-ko.
Yeah.
He was a high-ranking police officer in Hong Kong, but he was secretly discovered to be a communist spy.
Right, and he was brought to this exact facility for interrogation.
Yeah, and later on, during the major riots in 1967, leftist leaders and even prominent actors were detained in these cells.
The facility was an instrument of intense psychological pressure. And the geography is key here, too. It was completely hidden away on the quiet edge of Mount Davis, intentionally isolating the detainees. Meanwhile, the bustling, prosperous, free trade hub of Hong Kong operated just a few miles away.
Here's the part that I cannot wrap my head around. In 2013, this entire site was redeveloped. Over 580 million Hong Kong dollars were poured into it to turn it into the University of Chicago Booth School of Business Asia campus.
It is quite the pivot.
It's a stunning piece of modern architecture, sure. But they integrated the detention center right into the campus. You could walk across the old Royal Engineers Bridge. Tourists can literally see the heavy iron cell doors. Original prison cells from blocks A and B are now being used as student study rooms and heritage exhibits.
It creates a deeply jarring juxtaposition, for sure.
But wait, explain the logic of that to me. You literally have business students cramming for corporate finance exams inside the exact same concrete boxes where Cold War spies were interrogated.
Yeah.
How does a city mentally reconcile that kind of overlap?
Academics refer to this dynamic as hardened control.
Hardened control.
Yeah. Think of it this way. Hong Kong's global brand has always been about free markets, bustling trade, and the strict rule of law. But to maintain that economic stability during the massive ideological storms of the Cold War, the colonial government utilized a very hard, hidden police apparatus.
Ah, so the detention center is the hard control.
Exactly. And the modern business school built over it isn't just a quirky architectural choice. It's a perfect physical metaphor for how the city processes its history. The sleek, transparent glass of global capitalism is literally resting on the heavy, oppressive concrete foundations of Cold War intelligence.
Wow.
The city doesn't necessarily erase the dark pulps of its history, it just repurposes them to serve the modern narrative of success.
That is profound. So we've talked about the dead, the military, the spies. But there is a massive piece of this puzzle missing.
The everyday people.
Right. What about the ordinary people just trying to survive the fallout of all these historical events? Ironically, the very land at the bottom of the mountain where the 1894 plague victims were buried eventually became home to thousands of post-World War II refugees.
Yeah, the 1950s saw a massive influx of people fleeing political upheaval in mainland China. The city was just completely overwhelmed, and a sprawling squatter settlement erupted on the slopes of Mount Davis.
It was chaotic, desperate living.
Very much so. In 1950, there were violent political clashes between rival refugee factions in the area. This actually prompted the government to forcefully relocate about 7,000 people to a place called Rennie's Mill.
But not everyone left. The ones who stayed on Mount Davis started to organize themselves. They built what became known as the Civic Village, or the cottage area.
And we aren't talking about throwing together flimsy tin shacks either.
No, not at all. Our sources note that with the help of NGOs and Catholic groups, these impoverished refugees managed to scrape together anywhere from 1,200 to 3,000 Hong Kong dollars per family, which, in the 1950s, for a refugee,
Yeah.
that was a staggering amount of money.
Oh, an incredible sum. They used that capital to build sturdy stone houses. They were creating a permanent community out of basically nothing.
They really did. They had small factories, barbershops, schools. It was a fully functioning, self-sustaining ecosystem right on the side of the mountain.
This is a brilliant example of what urban sociologists call self-generated order.
I love that term.
It fits perfectly. When formal governance fails to provide housing or structure for a marginalized group, the community will organically generate its own complex social and economic structures to survive. The Civic Village was the ultimate story of refugees transitioning themselves into active citizens without waiting for permission from the state.
But as we know by now, permanence on Mount Davis is an illusion.
Unfortunately, yes.
By 2002, the entire Civic Village was demolished for urban redevelopment, completely leveled.
It really highlights the extreme vulnerability of non-formal architecture. If a community isn't officially zoned and sanctioned by the state, it can just be erased with a single administrative decision.
It's like deleting a file from a computer. But the ghost data is still sitting on the hard drive, because the village is gone. But if you walk along Mount Davis Path today and look closely into the brush, the physical foundations are literally still there, tripping up hikers.
Yeah, the ruins are everywhere.
You can spot hidden concrete stairways leading to nowhere, abandoned stone walls. They are the footprints of a community of thousands that lived right beneath where the modern youth hostel sits.
And that really brings the spatial overwriting of this mountain full circle. Just think about the physical soil we've been tracking today.
It's the exact same piece of earth.
Exactly. It went from a plague cemetery for isolated dock workers to a paved military access path to a bustling refugee village, and now to modern public housing plots and a sleek business school.
It is truly staggering when you step back and look at the whole picture. I mean, in one single hill, just 269 meters high, we've traveled from underground graves exposing the politics of public health to Eurasian monuments overcompensating with traditional architecture to forge an identity.
A huge journey.
We've gone up to World War II cannons pointing the wrong way because of imperial blind spots, down to Cold War spy cells holding up the floors of a modern business campus, and through the ghost data of refugee villages that built themselves from nothing.
It is a microcosm of human history, compressed and layered into one hillside. It shows us that geography isn't static. It's a ledger of who held power, who was marginalized, and who ultimately got to write the final draft of the landscape.
So the next time you visit a beautiful tourist viewpoint or hike a pristine historical trail, look past the polished surface. Wonder what is physically buried under your feet. What used to be there before the trees grew back.
And consider this as you go about your week. If Mount Davis represents a society constantly rewriting its physical space, layering the living over the dead, and modern glass over dark history, what hidden layer of history is currently being overwritten right beneath your hometown's most popular tourist attraction? And 100 years from now, when archaeologists dig into the ground, what will they deduce from the layer we are actively leaving behind today?